She was 22 years old, and for all practical purposes, invisible. She had no family left to speak of, no savings tucked away, and no plan beyond the stubborn decision to keep moving forward one day at a time. Everything she owned fit into a canvas pack: 2 changes of clothes, a tin cup, half a sack of oatmeal, and a small wooden mallet with a head of dense hornbeam and a handle worn butter-smooth by a dead woman's hands. It was the only thing anyone had ever made specifically for her, and she carried it wrapped in a wool scarf against her ribs, like a second heartbeat. With the $40 she'd been given for the sale of an old carpenter's bench, the last piece of furniture from the only workshop she'd ever called home, she paid the salvage fee on an abandoned sawmill cabin rotting at the edge of a frozen lake outside the town of Dunmore, Nova Scotia. Nobody in Dunmore thought much of the transaction. A few of them stood at the top of the ridge and watched her pick her way down the icy slope toward that slumping, moss-covered wreck of a building, and more than one of them laughed. What they couldn't see, what none of them thought to consider, was that beneath the cabin's collapsed floor joinery lay a truth that would undo the man who had cast her out and give her back everything she was owed. Settle in close, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Wren Calloway was not born in Dunmore. She was born inland, near the Annapolis Valley, in a farmhouse that smelled of wood smoke and beeswax, and she remembered it mostly in sensory flashes. The weight of quilts in winter, the particular sound her mother's shoes made on the kitchen floor, the way frost made lace patterns on the single window above her cot. Her parents died within a season of each other when she was 6. A bad winter followed by a worse spring fever, and she was taken in by her father's older brother, a man named Aldous Finch, who ran a small hardware and dry goods operation in Dunmore, and who accepted the child the way one accepts an unexpected bill, with poor grace and a long memory for the inconvenience. For nearly 15 years she lived in Aldous Finch's house as something between a niece and an unpaid shop hand. She stocked shelves, swept floors, kept the ledger, and learned very early to make herself agreeable and unnoticeable in equal measure. She learned to read the weather of a man's mood in the set of his shoulders. She learned that silence was usually safer than speech, and that the best way to avoid cruelty was to remain useful. Her only real solace in those years was Beatrice Oland. Beatrice Oland was the town's carpenter and joiner, a widow in her late 50s who had taken over her husband's trade when he died and never once apologized for it. Her shop sat at the bottom of a lane that ran off the main road, and it smelled of pine resin and linseed oil and something else, something alive and warm that Wren could not name as a child, but recognized later as the smell of honest work being done well. Beatrice had a way of looking at raw lumber the way a surgeon might examine a patient, with a kind of respectful attention, as though the wood itself had something to say, and she was simply listening carefully enough to hear it. She started letting Wren sit in the corner of the shop when the girl was about 10, then began asking her to hand tools, then to hold pieces steady, and then one afternoon, without any particular ceremony, simply handed her a small marking gauge and said, "Show me a line that runs true." Wren did. Beatrice looked at it for a moment, then nodded, and that was the beginning of a real education. Over the next decade, Beatrice taught her everything: how to read the grain of a plank and anticipate how it would move with moisture and cold, how to sharpen a chisel until it could split a hair lengthwise, how to cut a mortise that fit so cleanly the joint required no glue, only pressure. She taught her that good joinery was a conversation between pieces, that every part of a structure had a role, and that understanding the role was the foundation of everything else. She gave Wren the mallet on her 20th birthday, turning it in her hands and saying, in that plain, unhurried way she had, "The balance is right for your arm. I made it for you specifically. Don't lend it to anyone." It was the first thing anyone had ever made for Wren with intention, and she treated it accordingly. When Beatrice died that winter of a stroke that came on quickly and without warning, Wren felt the loss not just as grief but as a sudden, terrifying exposure. The way you feel when a wall you've been leaning against quietly for years simply disappears. She was left with the mallet, the skills Beatrice had given her, and the knowledge that without her mentor's presence, her position in Dunmore had become very fragile indeed. She was right to worry. The end came within 6 weeks. Aldous Finch called her into the back room of the hardware store. On a Tuesday morning in late November, the kind of raw, gray maritime morning where the cold comes through the walls as much as through the windows. He did not sit. He stood behind his counter with his hands folded in front of him like a man delivering a verdict he'd already written. And he told her that the house was needed. His son was coming back from Halifax with a wife. There wasn't room. He said it with the practiced calm of someone who has rehearsed the speech enough times to drain it of any remaining feeling. Wren asked about the arrangement they had. She had been keeping the accounts, had been doing work worth something, and Aldous placed a piece of paper on the counter. It listed what he called costs of room and board accrued over the previous 15 years, deducted against what he characterized as the reasonable wage for her shop work. The bottom figure showed that she owed him money. Not a great deal, but enough to ensure she left with nothing, and with the sense that she was in fact lucky to be going at all. She looked at the paper for a long moment. She had kept his ledgers. She knew, to the cent, what his actual operating costs were, and she knew that the figures before her were not derived from any real accounting. They were derived from the desire to have her gone without guilt. She did not argue. She had read the set of his shoulders too many times to believe argument would accomplish anything other than making the next few minutes unpleasant. She folded the paper, put it in her pocket, and went upstairs to pack her canvas bag. She left the next morning before Aldous came down. The $40 came from the sale of Beatrice's workbench. She had been named in Beatrice's will, and the bench was the only item the estate had to offer. She sold it to a cabinet maker in Tatamagouche, took the money, and went back to Dunmore, because she had no idea where else to go, and because there was a piece of unfinished business she couldn't quite bring herself to leave behind. The cabin at the edge of Briar Lake had been empty for at least 2 years. It had belonged to a timber surveyor named Owen Marsh, who had used it as a seasonal base camp until he didn't come back one autumn, and no one had seen him since. There were stories, the way there always are in small towns, about what had happened to Owen Marsh, but they were only stories. The county had taken possession of the property for unpaid taxes. The salvage rights were available for $40, which was the entire sum she had. She bought them on a Wednesday. By Thursday morning, she was standing in the snow at the top of the ridge with her pack on her back and her mallet tucked against her side, looking down at the cabin, and the people of Dunmore were watching. "That place is half rotten," someone called out. A man she recognized as a clerk from the post office. "What are you expecting to find down there?" She didn't answer. She picked her way carefully down the slope and got to work. The cabin, up close, was in worse shape than it appeared from the ridge. The roof had partially collapsed on the eastern end, and the snow had gotten in, over what must have been several seasons, rotting the subflooring in that corner completely through. The door had swollen and warped in its frame so badly that she had to shoulder it open, and when she did, the smell that came out was the particular cold, damp smell of long abandonment, mildew and dead air, and something faintly metallic that she couldn't place. She stood in the doorway for a moment and just looked. A surveyor's cabin, one main room, a stone hearth at one end cold and full of old ash, a wooden bunk frame against the wall, the canvas long since rotted off its lashings, a small table, a row of hooks by the door still holding a single canvas coat, stiff with age and cold, and the floor, pine boards, rough cut, which was what you'd expect. But she noticed something as she moved further inside, crouching to get below the collapsed section of roof. The boards near the center of the room were a different cut than the ones near the walls, finer. The joinery between them was tighter. She pressed a board with her thumb. It didn't flex. Whatever was beneath that section was solid. But she had other priorities first. She went back up the ridge to Dunmore and spent a careful portion of her remaining money. She had held back enough from the sale of Beatrice's bench for food, on a hatchet, a box of nails, a roll of tar paper, and a length of rope. The woman at the general store, a quiet person named Ada, gave her a long look and said nothing unhelpful, which Wren appreciated. The next days were hard. She patched the roof first, working alone, hauling tar paper up over the collapsed section and nailing it down in the wind while the cold worked at her fingers. She collected deadfall from the tree line above the cabin, split it small, and got the hearth going. She repaired the door frame with pieces of the collapsed roof timber, shaving them down with Beatrice's mallet and a chisel she'd kept from the workshop. The cabin was cold, but it was no longer open to the sky, and that was a start. People from the ridge occasionally came down to look. Usually they came in pairs or small groups, the way people do when they want the social comfort of shared skepticism. A couple of times someone called out something meant to be discouraging. She noticed that fewer people bothered as the days passed, and the cabin began, visibly, to take on a different character. Patched roof, solid door, stack of split wood growing by the south wall. A man named Eli, who ran the fishing supply down by the dock, left a bucket of salt cod on the slope one morning without a word, turned around, and went back up. She found it when she came out to collect snow to melt for water. She used the wood from Beatrice's mallet case. She had long since transferred the mallet to her pack to build a small shelf above the hearth and left a carved bracket on Eli's doorstep the following week. He examined it for a moment and then looked at her with a different kind of attention than she'd received before. On the fourth day, she went back to the center of the floor. She had been thinking about it. She worked the first board up with a pry bar she fashioned from a bent nail and a piece of roof strapping. And as it came free, she saw immediately what she had suspected. The boards in the center section were not set on the floor joists. They sat on a secondary frame, a box frame, set perhaps 4 inches below the surface of the main floor. The work was precise, better than anything a surveyor would have done to protect a food cache from mice. The joinery was deliberate, the frame dovetailed at the corners. It was the work of someone who knew what they were doing and intended the thing to last and to be unobtrusive. She tapped along the secondary frame with her mallet, listening. Beatrice had taught her to listen to wood the way a doctor listens to a chest. The sound changed near the east corner of the hidden section, hollow. She worked carefully, not with the pry bar but with a thin chisel, working along the seam where the change in sound began. There was a latch, not a padlock, nothing obvious, but a simple wooden tongue and groove catch, set flush with the surface so it was invisible unless you were looking for it and knew what you were looking for. She pressed it sideways with the flat of her chisel, and a section of the floor approximately 3 feet square lifted cleanly on a pair of recessed hinges. She held the lantern down into the space. The hidden compartment was dry, lined with cedar planks, which explained the faint smell she hadn't been able to identify. Cedar, not metal. Resting inside, wrapped carefully in oilcloth and tied with leather cord, was a stack of folded papers. Beside the papers, wedged carefully along the side wall of the compartment, were 3 long tubes of rolled drafting paper, the kind used for land survey maps, and tied with the same cord. And in the far corner, in a small tin cash box with a simple hasp lock, was a quantity of money. She lifted the cash box out first. The lock was a weak one. She had worked with enough hardware to know, and she popped it in under a minute with a bent wire. Inside was a collection of bills and coins that she counted twice to be sure, $380. A significant sum. Not a fortune in the way of legend, but in practical terms, given where she was standing, it was a profound sum. She set it aside and unfolded the papers. They were survey records. Land survey records, to be specific, for parcels of property covering a substantial area on the western side of Briar Lake and extending up into the timber stands on the ridge. The records were dated over a range of about 4 years and bore the stamp of the Provincial Surveying Office and the signature of Owen Marsh, Certified Land Surveyor. On their face, they appeared to be legitimate survey documents. But as she read through them, and she read carefully, because Beatrice had always told her that understanding a document required reading it the way you read a piece of wood, slowly and with full attention, she began to see the problem. The survey records described land boundaries, and in the margins, in a smaller different hand, someone had made notations, not corrections, annotations. References to different survey records by number, with small notes like conflicts with, or supersedes on file, or in one place, simply original, destroyed. She did not fully understand what she was looking at, but she understood enough. These records described the ownership boundaries of a large piece of land that included not just the cabin she was sitting in, but several properties that were currently held by other people in Dunmore, and someone had gone to considerable trouble to hide these records in a floor that was not meant to be found. She reached for the rolled drafting tubes. The first 2 contained the survey maps, corresponding to the written records. The third contained something different, a hand-drawn diagram, more careful and precise than any of the others, showing the same land area, but with property lines that were significantly different from the versions filed with the county office. In the corner of this map, in Owen Marsh's neat surveying hand, was a note, correct boundaries per original Crown grant. See attached. Filed copies altered by order of A. Finch, Hardware and Property Agent, November 1908. Originals held here for safety. If I am gone and you are reading this, take it to Halifax. She read it twice. Then she sat back on her heels in the cold cabin, with the lantern burning between her knees and Owen Marsh's hidden documents spread around her, and she understood several things simultaneously. She understood why Owen Marsh had not come back from his last survey season. She understood why Aldous Finch had been so deliberate, over the years, about keeping her grateful and occupied, and too exhausted to ask questions about the family business. She understood why the numbers in his ledger had never quite added up in the ways she privately expected them to. Aldous Finch had not just cheated her. He had been cheating the land itself. Or rather the people who owned it, or thought they owned it, or had once owned it and been quietly dispossessed of it by a man with access to the county records and enough local influence to make sure no one looked too closely. She sat with this knowledge for a long time. The fire had burned down to coals. Outside the window, the light was going gray and flat the way it does in Nova Scotia in January, when the day simply runs out of ambition. She rewrapped the papers in their oilcloth, tied the cord tight, and placed everything back in the compartment. She reset the floor panel. Then she sat by the rebuilt hearth in the dark and thought about what Beatrice would have done. Beatrice had been practical. She had never been a person who valued gesture over outcome. She would have said, "You have what you need, now use it correctly." The next morning, Wren went back up the ridge into Dunmore. She did not go to Aldous Finch. She went to the postal office and asked the quiet clerk, Ada, the same woman who had sold her the tarpaper, whether she knew the name of the Surveyor General's office in Halifax and how to address a letter to them. Ada gave her the information without asking why she needed it. Then she went to the office of a man named Dr. Samuel Howe, who was technically Dunmore's physician, but who had also, it was widely known, read law before medicine and was the closest thing the town had to a lawyer. She waited in his waiting room for an hour, then laid Owen Marsh's documents on his desk and told him what she had found and where. Dr. Howe was a methodical man. He read through every page, examined the maps, looked at the annotations in the margins, and read Owen Marsh's final note 3 times. He took off his glasses, set them on the desk, and looked at her in a way that suggested he was recalibrating something. "How long have you lived in Aldous Finch's house?" he asked. "Since I was 6, she said. He nodded and looked at the documents again. "And you had no part in keeping these records?" "I kept his shop ledger," she said. "The accounts for hardware sales, nothing related to property." "Did he know you had any surveying knowledge?" "He didn't know I had any knowledge that wasn't useful to him directly." Dr. Howe said nothing for a moment. Then, "These need to go to Halifax, in person, not by post." "I know," she said. "That's what Mr. Marsh wrote." He looked at her for a moment more. "I'll come with you." The journey to Halifax took 2 days by the time they arranged passage on a supply coach in the depths of January. Dr. Howe was good company, not talkative, but steady the way useful people tend to be. He explained the legal implications as he understood them on the first day's ride. That altering official survey records was a serious provincial offense, that property titles derived from falsified surveys were legally void, and the properties in question could potentially revert to their prior owners or their heirs, and that the disappearance of a certified surveyor in connection with those falsified records was a matter for the provincial police. The Surveyor General's office received them on the second morning, which Wren later thought was either good fortune or a sign that the right doors opened for the right documents. The senior officer who handled their case, a precise woman named Isabel Trant, took one look at Owen Marsh's original survey maps and the notations in the margins and called in 2 colleagues without excusing herself to explain. It took the provincial authorities 11 days to complete their initial review of the Dunmore property records. It took 4 more days for the provincial police to arrive in Dunmore. Wren was at the cabin when they came into town. She had gone back to work because the cabin still needed attention. The bunk needed rebuilding, the window frame needed resetting, and she had begun using scrap lumber from the collapsed roof section to build a small work table for herself. She was fitting a leg joint when Eli from the fishing supply came down the slope and stood in the doorway. "They've taken Aldous Finch," he said. "About an hour ago." Went quietly. He paused. "Nobody's sure yet what it all means." "It means the survey records were falsified," she said without looking up from the joint. "There are families in this town who have been paying rent to Aldous Finch for land that was never legally his to rent, and at least one person who found out about it and didn't come home." Ely was quiet for a moment. "Owen Marsh?" His note was clear enough. She fitted the leg into the mortise and tested the joint. It was solid. "I expect the police will want to look into his disappearance properly." He came in and sat down on the rebuilt bunk frame, and they were quiet together for a while, in the way of people who don't need to fill silence to feel comfortable in each other's company. In the weeks that followed, Dunmore shifted in the slow, grinding way that communities shift when a central pillar turns out to have been hollow. The news spread first in rumor, and then in harder fact, that Aldous Finch had been filing property deeds in the county records based on survey documents that had been altered, that several families, including the Pelletier family, who rented 3 acres on the west side of the lake, and old Frances Noonan, who had paid Finch ground rent on her garden plot for 14 years, were owed restitution. That Owen Marsh, who had been quietly written off as a man who had lost his way or drunk himself into the wilderness, had in fact been the person who documented the fraud, and whose disappearance remained under active investigation. Aldous Finch, facing charges that included fraud, falsification of public records, and complicity in the disappearance of Owen Marsh, was taken to Halifax and did not return to Dunmore for a long time. And when news of that reached the town, it did not produce the shock that might have been expected. It produced a quieter thing, a kind of collective exhale, like a room full of people who have been holding their breath without realizing it. Wren, as the finder of the suppressed survey documents and the person who had brought them to the proper authorities, was recognized by the provincial court as the legitimate owner of the salvage rights to the cabin, along with its contents. The cashbox money, Owen Marsh's emergency fund, the money he had set aside against the possibility that things went wrong, which they had, was ruled hers by the court as well, on the grounds that it had been found as part of the salvage. $380. She did not feel triumphant. She felt something steadier and quieter than triumph. The particular feeling of ground beneath your feet after a long time of not being sure the ground would hold. She used a portion of the money to properly restore the cabin, not to renovate it into something it wasn't, but to bring it back to what it was clearly meant to be, a solid, well-built working space in a good location. She rebuilt the collapsed east end with proper joinery, cutting the corner posts herself and fitting them with the half-laps Beatrice had taught her, the joints so tight that no draft could find a way through. She reframed the windows, reset the floor, and replaced the rotten board and batten on the north wall with fresh milled cedar. She built a proper workbench along the south wall, long and heavy and anchored to the wall stud so it wouldn't shift, and hung her chisels on a rack above it. She put the mallet on a small wooden block at the left end of the bench, where it sat the way it always had, present and useful and carrying the quiet weight of everything Beatrice Oland had given her. Word had got around about the quality of the work she'd done on the cabin itself. Eli sent people to her. Ada sent people to her. The Pelletier family, once they understood that Wren's discovery had meant the return of their land title, sent their oldest son to ask if she would look at a broken axle housing on their mill wheel. Not blacksmithing, but the wooden framework around it, which had cracked along the grain and was failing. She went and looked and told them what she could do and what it would cost, and they agreed, and she did the work in 2 days and it held. She was not yet known as a carpenter in the formal sense. She was known as the woman at the Marsh cabin, the one who had dragged a future out of a wreck on a frozen hillside while people stood on the ridge and watched. She was known as someone whose work was worth paying for. That was enough to begin with. It was, as it turned out, exactly the right amount of ground on which to build. The mallet still lives on its block at the left end of her workbench. She has never lent it to anyone. She doesn't need to explain why. Anyone who has ever held a tool made specifically for their hand already knows. Tonight we'll leave you with this. Wren didn't find the hidden floor because she was lucky. She found it because she was paying attention, because a good woman had spent years teaching her to be patient and to listen to what materials tell you when you're quiet enough to hear. What we want to ask you is this. Has someone ever taught you something that only became useful much later, long after they were gone? Let us know in the comments below. We read everyone.